So in taking a look at Western Europe, we last left off during a time frame that's known as the Reformation. All right, when the Catholic Church splits into different sects or different types of Christianity. It's no longer just Roman Catholic. There's Lutheran, Presbyterian, Anglican, the whole 9 yards. What's next up in this evolution of thought is the concept of enlightenment. And bear in mind that the Enlightenment wasn't what they walked around calling it, and it wasn't really like it was one event. It's simply a time frame that, admittedly, was restricted to educated, mostly elite males. But the ideas of this Enlightenment soon spread into numerous facets of society and across multiple continents. The Enlightenment also came on the heels of this idea you see here, the scientific revolution, which was the process by which human reason could be used to understand the inner workings of nature. Now, the Enlightenment sought to take these concepts and apply them to human affairs. The Enlightenment thinkers believed that knowledge could transform human society, even though often these thinkers would often disagree with one another. Now, they tended to be satirical, they were critical, and they were hostile to established authorities. And they would often attack what they called arbitrary government. They attacked the concept of divine right, meaning God gives certain people the right to rule, and old aristocratic privilege. Now, some of these Enlightenment ideas transcended all the way to the top. And the concept of men of reason transforming society led to the rise of what were called enlightened despots. And this is an offshoot of the concept of absolute rule or absolutism. Now, previously, absolute rulers claimed that their right to rule came directly from God, in a process known as the divine right of kings. However, the influence of the Enlightenment led rulers to still claim authority under the guise that they're providing order, harmony, and reason to their domains. So-called enlightened despots sought to demonstrate that they were worthy of ruling, and sometimes they went as far as to attempt reforms in their lands. Frederick the Great of Prussia changed the laws in his lands so that reason and justice mattered more than tradition. And the woman you see here, Catherine the Great of Russia, was really enticed by the ideas of the Enlightenment, but ultimately this movement failed to enact large-scale change. So yes, there were enlightened despots, but at the end of the day, nothing sweeping happened. Now this will give you an introduction to some of the philosophes, or some of the new thinkers. Philosophes is the French word for intellectuals, and it influences our modern word philosopher. You'll see that, like John Locke, most of these are men. And there were some prominent women that were influential. New ideas about government. All right, so mainly these are government ideas. They'll develop, and there'll be some of the most prominent contributions. John Locke is an Englishman, and he developed the concept of the social contract, or that each individual is accorded with basic rights to what he called life, liberty, and property. In exchange for the protection of these rights, each individual agreed to surrender some of their autonomy to the local government. So you give up some of your freedoms in exchange for protection, so long as your government is providing these three things, life, liberty, and property. And in the United States, it came to be known as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Even though, according to Locke, only males who own property would be protected, he still laid out basic tenets for governments to follow. Now, fellow Englishman Thomas Hobbes believed that human life was nasty, brutish, and short, and he advocated for the concept of an authoritarian ruler to provide order and stability. So that concept of an enlightened despot comes from Hobbes. Now, Hobbes lived through what was called the English Civil War, and he witnessed the chaos that occurred following the execution of the monarch. So he wanted authority, but he used logic as his guiding principle instead of divine right. And finally, the Frenchman Montesquieu took these ideas even further when he argued for limits on government powers in a constitution. Locke wanted separate and balanced executive and legislative powers. All right, so the first guy, Locke, is all about executive and legislative, whereas Montesquieu added that he believed the judicial branch, all right, a judicial branch should be separate and not under the sway of any executive. So with each of these three individuals, we do see the foundations of modern American political thought. Now, as it pertains to new concepts of society, economically speaking, Scotsman Adam Smith argued in favor of self-regulating free market economies. And the concept of laissez-faire, or leave it alone, let it be, was often used to describe his ideas. He argued that if a division of labor was applied to all tasks and each country produced what it was best at, trade with other nations, everyone would win. Instead of basing his concepts on what was called mercantilism, mercantilism is a zero-sum economic game, he used reason to explain the human potential of economic systems. Everyone can benefit. Everyone can win under Adam Smith's self-regulating free market. Rationalism begins to rise, and most of these philosophies took a dim view of religion, as seen by Voltaire, the Frenchman. In his most famous novel, Candide, Voltaire made a mockery of what he perceived as the corruption and injustice of the world around him. Now, he took a very dim view of organized religion, and he incurred the wrath of religious authorities when he argued that religion often served as a barrier to rational inquiry. Now, because of this, he was jailed on 2 separate occasions. So his controversial beliefs didn't exactly benefit him in the long run. Now again, many of these influential figures were men, but women of high class would often host what were called salons, meaning drawing rooms. And this is where most discussion would take place, because the philosophies would engage in spirited debate on the latest ideas in science, philosophy, and literature. The problem is that even though women served as hosts, they often were not allowed to participate. Men who advocated for a freer society did not often extend these ideas to feminism or women's rights. But, in all honesty, this reflected their views of men as their time. The English author, Mary Wollstonecraft, wrote what was called Vindication of the Rights of Women, and she demanded that women be afforded equal access to education, citizenship, and financial freedom. Now, all of these ideas mainly had the greatest influence on the French middle class, or the bourgeoisie. The upper classes used the salons more as a social event. They're just there to see what people are wearing, flaunt the latest fashions. While the lower classes of tradesmen and farmers, they're not worried about all this. They're too concerned with their daily lives to pay much attention to these developing thoughts. Voltaire and others thought that the lower classes were too tradition-bound as they stood. So the middle class, this new emerging bourgeoisie, is what's going to benefit, at least in the short term, from this movement.